Hi and welcome to this video where the Mini Cooper has made a bit more progress. We've now got the clutch connected, the gear change cables back on. You might be able to see here the alternator's back in, water pump, the inlet manifolds on there. I've also got a few cables now connected at the back of the engine and the starter motor heat shield's back on. So things are starting to come together now, thankfully. So hopefully it won't be too long. So hopefully you'll enjoy this video and thank you for watching. So we'll start by refitting the two gear change cables into the black plastic bracket that's mounted on the gearbox. So ironically I did find this a little bit fiddly. Now I think when I removed these I probably took out some of the spring out of these metal clips. So as you can see, it sort of should just pop into those ears on each side. So you may need to spring them out a little bit more. Now I popped a little bit of grease there. Basically any grease really. I think this was some sort of ceramic bike grease that I used there. Just to give it a little bit more of a smoother connection. Though I was concerned that by greasing it is a risk of it actually popping off, but hopefully not. We'll find out. And I did the same for the other cable. So again, you may want to sort of just re-bend those metal ears outwards so that when you do put it into this bracket they sort of clip in nicely. I think mine had lost a bit of the spring there. So we just push this onto the ball joint, get that out of the way, and then get one of those. You can see my brain thinking, is this correct? I wasn't sure, but it must be correct. Yeah, I think that you just need to make sure those ears are bent out a bit. I think I probably squashed them a bit when I removed the cables. Okay, so we'll give that a quick check. And that all seems okay. Here's a couple of photos showing those spring clips in position. So now we can refit the clutch slave cylinder bracket back onto the gearbox. So as you may recall, I actually had issues getting one of these bolts out. So I'm definitely putting some copper ease on these bolt threads because one of them was pretty much stuck in there. It was quite a close call that, whether could have ended up with the sheared bolt, but hopefully that won't happen again now. So using 10mm socket we need to just tuck these two bolts in and then we'll torque those to 24 Newton meters like so. Where's the click? Okay, so we can now take the slave cylinder itself. I'm going to put a bit of grease on the end there. Again, this is a bit of ceramic cycle grease. It's normally pretty good on bikes, so I have a bit on there. And then we can just gently push this in. The plastic part actually goes over the bracket and then it sort of semi-holds it in place, which is quite handy. Sort of holds it there while you can get your bolts ready. As you can see, I'm absolutely paranoid over these two bolts sticking. And I put plenty of copper ease on there. So I'll just tighten those up. My spanner actually got stuck on the other side. As I tightened it up, it actually wouldn't come off. I had to use a screwdriver to push it. So we'll check this now. You can actually see that bracket flexing with the pressure on the clutch spring. But all is working, so that's good. So now to refit the main power cables along the back of the engine and to the alternator. I will re-tin the connections as well. So if we have a quick look at this power cable, we can see the battery there on the right, and that feeds to the starter motor, and a second connection goes off to the alternator. And there's also the power steering motor connector. And here's a different view, so you can actually see the starter motor connections, as there's two of them. So I started to clean the connections, and then I realised I was actually taking the tinning layer away, which would expose the copper, and then that would oxidise and could actually create a poor connection later on. I started with the Dremel. I got a bit fed up with that because it took so long. I then went on to something a bit beefier, and this did the job quite nicely. Bit awkward to hold, but very effective. So that's nicely cleaned up. One thing you do need to do is make sure everything is scrupulously clean, or the solder won't flow very well, as I will show here. Because my Dremel had a little bit of oil on it, then I wiped it with my finger and sort of contaminated it with oil. So anyway, so the procedure is you put some flux on there, which chemically cleans it, and then I was hoping my portable soldering iron would actually be sufficient to do this, but didn't seem to be quite making it work. I think the copper was extracting the heat just too quickly, so it's just not melting. So again, we decided we'll up the game a bit. I know this will work. I'll have to just be very quick so I don't start melting anything else. There we go, it starts to flow nicely. Could have gone a little bit better than that. But as soon as you've got some dirt on there, that brush was actually contaminated with some oil, and that the connections just don't take the solder. So cleanliness is extremely important with this, as you've just seen. Again, it's still not really clean enough. It's struggling there to flow. I mean, it's better than it was. So we'll now have a go on the other connections that go to the back of the starter motor. Hopefully this will be better. And we'll try and make sure this is a bit cleaner. So I'm not going to use the Dremel, so I think that was actually contaminating it. So let's see how this goes. That's flowing a lot better there. Give that a quick wipe. So that's not looking too bad. So I've obviously got to do that on the other side as well. Like so. So that should give us quite a good connection. Obviously there's two cables that go to the back of this starter motor, because one leads on round to the alternator. So this type of blowtorch worked a treat actually. It certainly got the copper hot enough, but you have got to be very quick, otherwise you'll start melting all the rubber insulation. So that's looking pretty good. And then you need to obviously clean the flux off, because the flux will carry on sort of chemically eating away. So you do want to try and clean that off, sort of deactivate it. And then I need to put the wiring loom back together now with a couple of cable ties. So this is the alternator part. Make sure those line up, because they've got to go onto the back of the starter motor. Like so. And then we need to start to tuck that down the back of the engine. I'll just get this little fuse box out of the way for the moment. And let's see if we can get this down the back. It's just got to go down there. I'll try and show a view of this with a wide angle lens. I'm just sort of getting it there around the front because that's the alternator cable. So there's a photo showing the two connectors and where they need to go. So we've got our wide angle lens here so that you can see down the back of the engine. So we've got the two main terminals on there that go to the starter motor. It's basically like a feed through, because obviously the starter motor needs power, but we also need to get power back from the alternator to the battery. So we tighten that with a 13mm socket, and I will tighten that to 14 Newton meters in a minute. So I'm just going to pop, this is the main power cable for the steering motor. That should actually clip in, but doesn't. So I will make sure I cable tie all this, keep it all in place. It did have cable ties originally, so it's always a good idea to pop them back in. As you can see here in this photo, there is a place for the cable tie to go through. They do supply the little mounts for cable ties, so it's best to try and use them. And that's the one holding the power steering cable. I'll now tighten that nut to the 14 Newton meters. Wait for our click, there's our click. Okay, so we can now feed this cable round, and then we've got another little bracket here that goes on the end of the engine where the pulleys are. It's like a copper bracket, that. And then that's a 16mm socket. Wasn't sure of the actual torque of it, so just did that hand tight. And then obviously we've got the next one following around towards the front of the engine, and again that's 16mm. Okay, so we've got our cable now to the front, so we can now refit the coolant pump. So we can take our water pump now, just check it sits on there nicely, and obviously put our pipes back on. Now I have put a little bit of rubber grease in there, just to hopefully help things along. But obviously if you grease the inside of a pipe, there is a risk it could actually come off under pressure. But it does make putting the pipes on a lot easier with just a slim smear. So okay, so this is our main pipe to the engine block. So that's on now. I'm getting these pipes both ready now, so I can just lift the pump up and pop it on to those two pipes. And like I said, they will slip in quite easily because I have put a little bit of rubber grease on there. Again, not sure if that's a good idea or not, because obviously it will make things a little bit slippery and could possibly push itself off under pressure. So both of the pipes are now on, so we can put the 4 bolts back in. Again, I'm going to put a little bit of copper slip on there just for my paranoia, and then using a 13mm socket we can tighten these up. So we'll whiz those on. 1, 2, 3 and 4. So we can now take a look at refitting the alternator. I'm just going to make sure that cable's tucked over there, because it's got to go underneath the alternator, or the back of the alternator. And I'm just going to get some copper slip on my bolts again to help with my paranoia. Probably don't need quite as much as that. Okay, so let's bring the alternator up So the cable just sits behind there. Obviously don't want to trap or pinch that cable. And then we've got the 3 bolts that go in, and those are tightened with a 10mm socket. So we just spin those in, like so. And then I'll get the main power connector on there. So it's a very small nut and a little split washer there. So you don't want to lose that split washer. Pop that on, and then that's tightened with a 10mm spanner. Now I will need to torque all these up, so that's 10 Newton meters for that little nut. There's our click. And then 25 Newton meters for the alternator. And then we will need to do the water pump, which will be 30 Newton meters for those 4 bolts. I'll do those, tighten those cross diagonally just to try and even the pressure. Okay, so that's those 2 items in place now. So we mustn't forget the engine knock sensor, because that's underneath the inlet manifold. So you definitely don't want to forget to put this on. That could be quite a disaster trying to get to that. Again, the old copper grease is going on there. And I'll just pop that on, and this is tightened with a 15mm socket. And the cable points upwards, because we're going to feed that through the inlet manifold. So I'll tighten that now to 22 Newton meters. And I'll also, while I'm at it, make sure we put the extension cable on for the alternator, because again you won't be able to access that once the inlet manifold's on. So my little clip's broken, so I'll have to cable tie that. Plastics do go brittle with engine heat. So we can now refit the top coolant to radiator hose. So that goes behind the back of the oil dipstick, like so, and then we can clip that on. I actually noted that on the tube there is a white line that you can see there now, which I presume is actually like a location line for the correct position of the hose, unless it's just coincidence. So now to refit the inlet manifold. So we need to remove the dipstick, and what I'm going to do is just clean the surfaces. I'm going to just very lightly scrape these. It's probably more advisable to actually use something like the 3M Rolock discs, which ironically I actually do have, but for some reason completely slipped my mind. So you can get the Rolock, which is like a white colour one, which is 120 grit and is absolutely ideal for this sort of thing. And it's obviously a lot more gentle than a wire brush. So that's what I'd recommend. So I'm cleaning that now with some alcohol, and I'm cleaning these seals as well. Now these really should be replaced. You can buy 4 of them on eBay for £11.50. Like I said, because this car has sort of no value to me now, because it's just being taken apart for YouTube, then I'm obviously not going to spend too much money on parts. So here I'm now going to just put a bit of sealant on here, and this is 3-bond 1184, which again I don't recommend you use. This is actually for like metal against metal, like on a timing chain housing. I bought this, it was quite expensive for a Honda CR-V when I did the head gaskets, and since I still have some, and it is quite expensive. So with all these inadvisable things to one side, we can now fit the actual inlet manifold. So I am actually hoping this sealant will still actually do a good job of sealing these as it needs to. So I'm just going to get the knock sensor wire through the middle of the inlet manifold like so, and position that in. I'm going to try not to smear the sealant that I've popped on there, so I'm going to try and hold it in position and try not to move it while I get a couple of bolts in there quickly. So it's a 10mm socket for these, and there is 5 bolts. So I'm just going to pinch those up tight, though not too tight. And what I'll then do is I'll torque these to 26 Newton meters, and ideally you would start in the middle and work outwards. So that hopefully that improves the seal. Whoops, just dropped the socket there. So that's the 4th one, and then the final 5th one. So we've got a little breather pipe here that we need to just pop onto the camshaft cover. So that's our knock sensor cable. We'll leave that there for the moment, and then the hose just clips in on the little plastic clip under the inlet manifold. So make sure the dipstick goes back in like so, and then we've got another pipe that sits on the top there and goes to the throttle body. Now the little metal clip was broken on this, so it's very difficult to actually squeeze it. So what I did is I cheated and put a little bit of red rubber grease on. So I put the clip in the final position and then just pushed it on, and it went on okay. Right then, so now to wiring to the oil pressure switch, the power steering motor and the starter motor solenoid. So here's a quick photo showing the low power stroke signal cable, and here you can see the starter motor connector, the power steering signal cable and the oil pressure sensor. So I'm just going to clean this solenoid connector there, not too much, otherwise I'll obviously have to re-tin it. So, and that's our oil pressure connector there. A little bit of a close-up view for you. You can see the colours of the wires going to the power steering on that one. Okay, so we've got to tuck this down the back of the engine, and it does need to go below where the 2 pipes are for the heater matrix. So just tuck that down there. I've actually put a little bit of blue tape on there now because the original tape was starting to unwind. So try and get it down there nicely tucked underneath those 2 metal pipes. I'll try and go onto a wide angle camera shot now so you can actually see down there. So there's one little nut there, take that off, and then we can get the cable there for the solenoid. So that's what actually triggers the starter motor when we turn the key in the ignition. So that's a 10mm socket. Just nip that up. We will need to torque that as well, and that's torqued to 8 Newton meters. Like so. So that's the power steering connector, which I'll probably go under the car to connect. But I'll get the oil pressure sensor on now. So that normally just pushes on and the red clip pushes over and locks it in position. My one is broken. So this is the power steering signal cable. Push that on, and then so it's worth putting a couple of cable ties on here so you can see that in this photo, and also the heat shield upper dowel, which we need to locate the heat shield on. But first what I'll do is to refit the internal heater matrix hoses. So we need to tuck the power cables underneath these pipes. I wasn't actually sure whether they sat in the middle between the two pipes, but I'm pretty sure they actually went underneath. So I'll just get these pipes on there, get this bottom one locked on first, using a pair of water pump pliers there. Probably could have gone on a little bit further than that. Might need to check that later on. And then the second hose. Like so. So that's the hoses to the heater matrix on. So we can now refit the starter motor heat shield. So for this we need a 10mm socket. I'm just going to remove the bolt that I put in there so I didn't lose it. Just see it there. So you'll notice I have cable tied the cables all down there. So we've got two dowels that this fits on. You can see them there on the end. Again, I've put a little bit of rubber grease in there just to help them slide over the metal dowels. So you need to sort of tuck it down there and push it to the right onto those dowels, and then we can put the single bolt in. Again, I've covered that in copper slip, so hopefully it doesn't get stuck, because it's obviously in a high heat area there. And then we'll torque that to 9 Newton meters. And then I'll just show you underneath where the dowel is at the bottom. There you can see it. So that's the lower dowel. So here's some reference photographs. So here's the main wiring power loom that went to the back of the engine, and there's the different angle there. And then this was the low power signal cable, and again another view there, and the starter motor connections, and the heat shield on the starter motor. So I find myself thanking Eric Betancourt once again for an even more generous donation. So thank you very much for that, Eric. And I'm glad I've been able to help you with the timing chain on your Mini. Hopefully your car will be running soon. I would also like to add that Eric is actually a singer-songwriter and has his own YouTube channel, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. So thanks again, Eric, and everyone, thank you for watching and have a good weekend. So you've been watching Fitting Ancillary Components back onto my Mini R50, and thank you for watching, and I hope this video helps you refit your Mini R50 engine back into your car. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in September 2021, and I can be found on Instagram and Facebook under Coats and Gators.